Nearly 2 years ago, a prisoner in Texas made a request to the prison where he lived. It was a request for what his last meal should be before he was going to be executed. The man said that this was what he wanted to be his last meal. 2 chicken fried steaks, each with gravy and sliced onions. Also a bacon cheeseburger, but he wanted it to be a triple with 3 hamburger patties in addition to the bacon. Also an omelet that had cheese and more ground beef in it, and tomatoes and onions and bell peppers and jalapeno peppers. He also wanted a bowl of fried okra with ketchup on the side. He wanted a pound of barbecued meat of some kind, presumably pork or beef or something. A pound of barbecue with half a loaf of white bread to eat the barbecue with. Remember, this is Texas. Also, he wanted 3 fajitas. He also wanted a whole pizza. He requested a meat lover's pizza, which, as far as I can tell, is a Pizza Hut branded pizza that has pepperoni and ham and more ground beef and bacon and sausage on it. He also requested a pint of Bluebell ice cream, vanilla flavor, and he asked for a slab of peanut butter fudge with crushed peanuts on top. He then also asked for 3 root beers to wash it all down. That was his requested last meal before he was executed by the state of Texas. He requested the meal. The prison obtained the meal for him. And then he said he was not hungry and did not eat any of it. And that was why Texas got rid of the practice of granting prisoners their chosen final meal before their execution, because of what Lawrence Russell Brewer did for his last meal before Texas killed him. Just before his execution, Lawrence Brewer, the same guy, told KHOU in Houston that he had no regrets, that the crime for which he was being executed, he would do it all over again tomorrow.
As far as any regrets, no, I have no regrets. No, I would do it all over again, to tell you the truth.
I'd do it all over again, to tell you the truth. What he did not regret, what he said he would do all over again, to tell you the truth, was the murder in 1998 in Jasper, Texas, of 49-year-old James Byrd Jr. Mr. Byrd accepted a ride from 3 young men, one of whom you just saw speaking from prison there a moment ago before he was executed, Lawrence Russell Brewer, also Sean Berry and John King. Those 3 young men picked up Mr. Byrd in Jasper, Texas on a June day in 1998. Instead of giving him a ride where he wanted to go, they beat him nearly to death. They tortured him. They urinated on him. They used a chain to tie him to the rear bumper of their pickup truck. They put the chain around his ankles, and they started driving, with him dragging behind the truck on that country road. He was alive when they tied him to the truck, and then they drove down that road for 3 miles. And that was how James Byrd Jr. died in Jasper, Texas. The forensic evidence, you see it circled there, spray paint, and marked there on the side of the road. The forensic evidence of James Byrd's death stretched for 3 miles down that road. Now, the men who killed James Byrd were covered in white supremacist and neo-Nazi tattoos, including one of the suspects having a tattoo that showed a black man lynched hanging from a tree, as well as Nazi tattoos. That defendant, John King, wrote a jailhouse letter to his co-defendant, Lawrence Brewer, a letter that was intercepted by prison authorities. It read in part, "Regardless of the outcome of this, we have made history. Death before dishonor. Sieg Heil." Lawrence Brewer had given himself the title Exalted Cyclops in a white supremacist gang. James Byrd died in Jasper, Texas in June 1998. 4 months after James Byrd died, 2 young men named Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson went to the Fireside Lounge in downtown Laramie, Wyoming. And in that bar, they picked up a 21-year-old college student named Matthew. They drove him out of town in their pickup truck. They tied him to a fence in the middle of a field, and they tortured him to death. 18 hours after he was left there, he was found by a passing cyclist who initially thought that he was a scarecrow. But he was a young man in a coma by then who would never regain consciousness and who died in the hospital 5 days later.
It was a gruesome discovery at this fence late Wednesday afternoon as the sun was setting. 2 bicyclists approached, and at first they said it looked like a scarecrow had been tied to the fence. Instead, the lifeless, savagely beaten body of 21-year-old Matthew Shepard, a University of Wyoming freshman, a gay man, barely alive tonight, in a coma, brain damaged, and on life support. It was 1 a.m. Wednesday morning. But Shepard, a small man, was allegedly beaten with the butt of a pistol, burned with cigarette butts, and finally tied spread eagle to the fence. left to die.
That was part of NBC's nightly news coverage back in October of 1998. And again, that happened about 4 months after the murder of James Byrd in Texas. It would take more than a decade after that. But in 2009, more than 10 years after those two predatory pack murders, one in Texas, one in Wyoming, it would take until 2009 for President Obama to sign into law the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crime Prevention Act. And when President Obama signed that into law and spoke about what that law meant, he stood with Dennis and Judy, the parents of Matthew Shepard, you can see to the president's right on the left side of your screen there, and also Betty and Luvon, who were the sisters of James Byrd, who you see on the right side of your screen there. He stood with them while the president explained this law.
To imagine the mindset of someone who would kidnap a young man and beat him to within an inch of his life, tie him to a fence and leave him for dead. It's hard for any of us to imagine the twisted mentality of those who'd offer a neighbor a ride home, attack him, chain him to the back of a truck and drag him for miles until he finally died. But we sense where such cruelty begins, the moment we fail to see in another our common humanity.
That was 2009. That was the first year President Obama was in office. And that bill was one of the signature achievements of his first term. See, that bill had been fought for a long time, but the previous president, George W. Bush, had killed an earlier version of the hate crimes law named for James Byrd and Matthew Shepard. He had killed it by threatening to veto it, but President Obama signed it. And the basic idea is to assert that there is a national interest, beyond even the standard interest we all have against crime. There is a national interest in American minority groups not being terrorized by violence that is meant to harm not only the direct victim, but to menace and intimidate the minority group that they belong to. Furthermore, the idea of a federal hate crime statute is to provide resources, prosecutory resources and investigatory resources to local authorities to make sure that crimes like this get prosecuted and that they get prosecuted successfully. And lastly, a federal hate crime statute can be used to bring cases directly, for the federal government to bring cases directly in crimes that otherwise would be handled at the state or local level. The Justice Department can try these crimes. And that is what the Justice Department is deciding right now about the Trayvon Martin case in Florida after the acquittal this weekend of the man who shot Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman. One of the changes in that law that is named for James Byrd and Matthew Shepard is that it used to be that the feds could only get involved on civil rights grounds like this if the victim was participating in activity that was considered to be federally protected when he or she was attacked. It was a weird jurisdictional quirk in the law that meant that unless you were voting or something, or trying to vote, going to school, or some other specific thing that had been adjudicated as something that the federal government had a role in protecting, unless you were doing something like that when you were attacked or killed, the law could not be applied to your case. Well, James Byrd was walking down a country road when his attackers found him. Matthew Shepard was at a bar when his attackers found him. But under the law that changed in 2009 in their names, that fact about each of those cases would not be a barrier to federal assistance with those cases. It would not be a barrier to the federal opportunity, for the federal government having an opportunity to step in to bring a case if local prosecutors had refused to do so on their own. Because of that change in the law, so it no longer has to be a federally protected activity that you're doing when the crime happens. Because of that change in the law, the Justice Department can now decide, and is now deciding, if it wants to bring a federal civil rights case, likely a hate crimes case, to try to convict George Zimmerman, even though that jury in that Florida state court found him not guilty. The Justice Department has put out a statement saying, quote, experienced federal prosecutors will determine whether the evidence reveals a prosecutable violation of any of the limited federal criminal civil rights statutes within our jurisdiction, and whether federal prosecution is appropriate in accordance with the department's policy governing successive federal prosecution following a state trial. Successive federal prosecution after the state trial. A lot of the commentary on this today assumes that this would be a radical step or an unusual step for the U.S. Justice Department to take. But, you know, the federal hate crime statute named for Matthew Shepard and James Byrd, it is not a dead letter. It gets used all the time. Last month, a Seattle man pled guilty to a federal hate crime under the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act. He pled guilty for assaulting a Sikh taxi driver. prosecuted by a federal prosecutor, guilty plea in that case. On the same day the FBI made that announcement, they also announced a federal hate crimes indictment under the same Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Act for a group that, for two people who attacked a gay couple on the street in Hillsboro, Oregon. Just a week before that, 4 people in Kentucky were sentenced to between 8 years and 30 years in prison for luring a gay man into their vehicle, driving him to a remote location, and beating him nearly to death before he escaped. Again, brought as a federal prosecution under the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Nobody knows if the Justice Department is going to bring a federal prosecution in this case, too. Really, nobody knows. There aren't even any good, educated guesses out there. And anybody who says they know what the Justice Department's going to do here and isn't actually the Justice Department is making it up. But if the Justice Department did decide to act here, if they did decide to bring charges in this case under that hate crimes law, it would put the issue of race, and specifically alleged racial motivation for the killing, at the very center of the case. That issue was central, of course, to the national furor and the national discussion about this case. But it was almost entirely absent as a formal legal issue in the formal legal proceedings that just concluded in Seminole County. Everything connected to race and the defendant's state of mind that was excluded from the state-level court proceedings would be at the center, would be the heart of any federal court case on this issue, if there ever will be one. Joining us now is Benjamin Jealous. He is president and CEO of the NAACP, which is advocating for the Justice Department to take up federal charges in this case. The NAACP is having its annual convention in South Florida this week. Mr. Jealous, Ben, thanks very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Rachel. It's great to be here.
So your organization is asking DOJ to file civil rights charges against Mr. Zimmerman in this case. What kind of feedback have you had from your call for that? How are people responding to that as an idea?
Well, first of all, the country has responded in a way that's just incredible. We have almost 1 million signatures just since the verdict. And that includes the fact that our servers were down for over 12 hours because the volume was too much for them to handle. At one point, we were getting about 100 signatures per second. And this just tells them, these are people of all colors from across the country who just believe our country can do better than what happened in Sanford, and who believe that the U.S. DOJ has a role to play in protecting all our children from people who would track them and taunt them and confront them and kill them on the street, and ultimately choose to engage because of their color. And there's a lot of disturbing information. I mean, let's not forget witness number 9. George Zimmerman's own cousin, who just a few days after this killing called the cops and said, I think he did this because of race. And let's not forget about the boys who live in that neighborhood, boys of color, who say that they felt like he targeted them because of their race. And let's not forget him saying that, these people, these punks always get away with this. And then looking and seeing that he had called the police dozens and dozens and dozens of times disproportionately about young men of color that he thought were suspect. And the reality is that there was no reason to think that Trayvon Martin was doing anything other than what he was doing, which was walking down the street with a can of soda and a bag of Skittles, can of iced tea and a bag of Skittles, and trying to get away from a man who he thought was creepy. And that man just kept tracking him, got out of the car, taunted him, ultimately pulled out a gun that he had intentionally purchased because it didn't have a safety, and shot him through the heart. And we believe in this country that if you do that to one of our boys of any color, that you deserve to be held accountable.
Ben, the issues that you're raising there, the factual issues and the witness statements that you're raising there, a lot of them were not covered in great detail in the Seminole County Courthouse in terms of the proceedings that ended on Saturday with that verdict. Do you think that if federal prosecutors did bring a federal case against Mr. Zimmerman, that there is sufficient direct evidence to bring the charges here under the kinds of narrow concerns that you need to be able to prove under hate crimes law? I mean, the hate crime statute is fairly narrowly drawn.
Well, it's fairly narrowly drawn, but what it says is, look, you have to be able to show that race was a factor and bodily harm was done. And yes, I believe there's enough evidence. We believe there's enough evidence to satisfy that standard. And the reality is that, the issue's been kind of muddled because we had a judge who seems to be a wonderful person in a bunch of ways, but we think made a very, she made a very serious choice to exclude any discussion of racial profiling. And the reality is look, we don't permit our officers to use race as grounds for suspicion and kill somebody after they taunt and confront them and not be held accountable. And we shouldn't let citizens not be held accountable for doing that either.
Ben, let me ask you, in terms of the response to the verdict, obviously there's been spontaneous reaction across the country, a lot of well-organized reaction too, but people just turning out in the streets and expressing themselves in reaction to this verdict. I know that you've been in touch with the Martin family, and I just wanted to ask you how they're doing following this verdict, if you can tell us, and how they feel about the way the country has responded.
Yeah, I think it would be better to let their lawyers speak for them. I've been in touch with their lawyers. We've actually given them, great space. We are here in Orlando, but they're back home in Miami. From what we understood, they were exhausted. They wanted time to go to church and to heal as a family, and we've respected that. But I think, all of us, certainly all of us who have children, can really, I think, empathize with what they must be going through. When I heard the verdict, I picked up my young son Jack, and I just held him and listened to him breathe. And there was a moment as I was just kind of swirling in the aftermath of this decision that it just occurred to me that Tracy Martin will never be able to hold his son Trayvon in his arms again and just hear him breathe. And that's because George Zimmerman tracked him, taunted him, disregarded the request of the police to stay in his car, and engaged him and killed him. And, again, there is enough evidence here, evidence the judge excluded, suggesting that race may have been a factor, including the testimony of his own cousin, of George Zimmerman's own cousin, to suggest that, yes, charges should be brought. Now, once charges are brought, the justice system will run its course. And we have from the beginning urged people to put their faith in the justice system. But you can't you can't say, put your faith in the justice system, but stop at the comma. No, you've got to let it run to the end of the sentence. And in our country, that includes state-level options and federal-level options as well. We need to let it run its course. We need to encourage DOJ to stay engaged. And yes, we believe, after looking at this, that there is enough to meet the bar that race was a factor and bodily injury was done.
Benjamin Jealous, President and CEO of the NAACP, someone I have known for a long time and who I am encouraged to see in such a crucial leadership role at a time we really need it as a country. Ben, thank you. Continued good luck to you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.